Back in the heyday of portable game systems, publishers were always looking for ways to bring their biggest franchises to the portable systems. As the gap between home systems and handheld systems widened further and further, this became more difficult, and the GBA was home to many incredibly ill-advised attempts to bring PS2, Xbox, and GameCube games to a system that had roughly the same power as a Super Nintendo. Sometimes, however, you'd get a developer who would manage to pull it off, and with Spyro Season of Ice, Digital Eclipse mostly finds themselves in that category. Season of Ice does a great job of replicating the experience of playing the first three console Spyro games, all the way from the basic mechanics like charging, fire breathing, and gliding, all the way down to some of the smallest details like the atlas and even the level exit animation. The problem with the game doing such a great job at adapting the style of the classic Spyro games generally is that it makes the things it does a poor job at feel that much worse. I'm generally a completionist when I'm playing the old school Spyro games, but the lack of a gem pointing mechanic for your Dragonfly buddy Sparks means you spend a lot of time wandering the huge maps, which are often lacking in meaningful landmarks and make it very hard to remember exactly where you've been. The game's isometric perspective, which a lot of GBA games adopted as a way to have graphics that looked sort of three-dimensional, also make it incredibly easy to fall into death traps. Bottomless pits, water, other assorted murder holes, and you can accidentally fly into one because you misjudged the relative height of another platform, an enemy knocked you into it with an attack that had a ridiculous amount of recoil, or something just bugged you out and knocked you into it for some indiscernible reason. Those death traps are particularly annoying because when you die, it resets the flammable items in every level that always make up one of the fairies you need to collect. So when you die for some frustrating reason or another, you then have to hunt every one of these down again. I highly recommend making use of a map to make this way less painful than it usually is, which you can find in various places online, and they make the levels so much easier to properly navigate. Something I very much appreciated since so many of the levels in this game are just a collection of platforms that dangle over the aforementioned death pits without those landmarks that you'd usually be able to use to remember the map by. The lack of interesting landmarks and levels is more than just a mechanical concern, though. There are so many levels in the first three Spyro games that are incredibly memorable, from the world's unique aesthetics, to the characters that inhabit them, to the little side missions you'd get sent on. Due to its basic design, Season of Ice has basically none of that. About the only unique thing I can remember from this game writing this review are a few levels where the professor has a time machine, since it kind of loops back on itself in a sort of interesting way. The vast majority of the other levels really are only distinguishable from each other by their base themes, like a level that's centered on honey and bees, or another that is just focused on lava. And it's not like these are things that couldn't be fixed in a handheld game, which is what makes them really frustrating. I understand that you have to make sacrifices when you move something over to handheld, but the things you'd think they'd have to sacrifice, they didn't have to. While the things you think would make the jump relatively easily somehow don't. When I mentioned earlier that this game adopts a large portion of the elements of its PS1 forebearers, it also unfortunately includes parts I never really liked in those games. The Sparks levels make it over pretty intact from Year of the Dragon, and they're fine, even if they feel more generic on a platform that has a ton of great 2D shooters. The Speedway levels, on the other hand, are so much worse here, as they manifest as behind-the-back shooter-type levels, not a genre that the GBA is particularly adept at, but the levels still demand a somewhat extreme level of perfection from the player. The game's final Speedway, in particular, is infamously difficult, which is a pretty huge problem since challenging the final boss requires you to have collected all 99 fairies, which means doing all of the speedways on hard. And that requirement for collecting every single fairy really kills a huge amount of goodwill this game had up until the point you realize that. Every particularly frustrating fairy is made infinitely more so by the fact that you absolutely need it in order to roll credits. As such, this game is alternatively a great platformer evocative of the original Spyro trilogy and an incredibly frustrating slog, and it's a real shame that's where it ends up. At some points while playing, I felt like I was playing the best version of a handheld Spyro that could have existed at the time. It really can be quite technically impressive for an early GBA game, but it's so often hampered by choices that seemingly have nothing to do with technical challenges, choices around level design and completion requirements being the most glaring. Finally, I feel like I should speak to how this game looks, especially if you're watching this video in full screen or even worse on a TV. Yes, this is partially due to the fact that we're scaling a GBA game well beyond its original intended resolution, but I'm doing so in the most accurate way without any smoothing, discounting any butchering of the video that I'm sure YouTube has done. I played this on an Analogue Pocket, both in handheld mode and in docked mode to do the gameplay capture, and I can confirm that it looks pretty good when playing it in the intended manner on a much smaller screen. That being said, the later Digital Extreme Spyro games and many other GBA games in the same style do look quite a bit better. But this game is not particularly awful looking in any way that makes it difficult to play or enjoy. And despite all the complaints I may have about it, I still recommend playing Spyro Season of Ice to people who like the old school Spyro games. For all of its problems, this is still not only a fascinating game for how good of a job it does at adapting the franchise from its PS1 roots to the GBA, but it's also a game that frankly does a much better job at making that leap to a new console than Enter the Dragonfly would when it came to PS2 just a year later. Despite all my issues with it, I think this game is absolutely still worth playing for Spyro fans, and given what I've heard about the later GBA games in the series, I am looking forward to seeing where their formula evolves from here. Just maybe don't worry about killing that final boss if you find yourself too frustrated. It's not worth it, trust me.